What's going on, guys? Zach here from PremiumBeat.com. You ever like shoot something, you're trying to figure out like what frame rate to do, so you just like pop it into 60 frames because you're like, oh, 60 frames is the frame rate that I should always be using. Well, that's not necessarily right, and I want to talk about why I've sort of diversified my frame rates, and it has changed the way I've shot stuff and the way my projects look. So let's talk about frame rates, let's talk about shutter speeds, let's talk about filmmaking. Let's get into it. So for those of you who have a camera, any sort of camera from like a cell phone to an SLR, you'll have frame rate options. And usually the range of frame rates that you can get is like 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, up to 60, and then some cameras go up to 120, and if you're lucky, you can get like 250. I know like my cell phone goes up to like 950 frames per second, which is like a ridiculous frame rate. So here's why I'm making this video. As a creator, I would just go to 60 frames per second because it was safe, because I was able to get two types of coverage. I could get my regular speed 24 coverage, and then I was also able to convert it to make it 60 frames to get that nice super duper crispy slow-mo B-roll look. Here's the problem. Whenever you shoot at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed has to be cranked to double whatever your frame rate is. So I have to crank my shutter speed to 120, which makes all of my footage look like this. So do you see where sort of the problem's coming from? So I really do believe that knowing what your frame rate is going to be before you start filming your coverage is really important. So I've sort of developed a rule of thumb, as well as I want to show you guys what each frame rate looks like at their native frame rate, and then as well as when they're sort of put into 24 frames. So let's start with actually the really cool stuff. Let's go to like 120. We're going to start up high and go low. 120 frames per second is probably one of the coolest frame rates that you can choose out of all of them, and it's also one of the laziest. I know you're like, Zach, I'm not lazy, I use 120, that's not being lazy. It's not necessarily that you're a bad filmmaker, but it's sort of an easy tool to make everything look super cool. Like literally you could film grass. So I would recommend, if you're shooting anything at 120, that make that action-packed, make that filled with energy. If it doesn't have energy, if it doesn't have flavor beyond just looking cool, maybe reassess your justification of shooting at that frame rate. So I would do like action-packed stuff. If you're shooting, let's say, an event, and the event is really quick and you need to capture a lot of coverage in a short frame of time, expanding your frame rate will allow you to have longer moments with less amount of time on set. And that actually speaks towards 60 frames per second as well, and actually other super high frame rates. If you have a short period of time on set, shooting at a higher frame rate will allow you to have more coverage to play with within the edit. Let's say you're like traveling somewhere and you've got to go to A to B, you've only got 15 minutes. It's probably in your best interest to change your frame rate to, let's say, 120. But here's sort of the downsides of that. First of all, it can look overused very quickly. It can also drag things out a lot. Like if you're filming an event or some sort of travel experience and everything is in super duper slow-mo, your message is gonna take way longer to address. And that's where like ultra slow-mo stuff really kind of doesn't hold any weight, because you're spending so much time on single individual moments rather than the grand scale, let's say, adventure or story or entire section of this event. So really think like if you have a lot to compile within a short period of time, maybe 120 frames is way too much and way too long for a short, quick travel video. Now let's go down frame rate. Let's go down to 60 frames per second. 60 frames per second is sort of the golden child of frame rates when you see it online. A lot of creators shoot at 60 frames per second because it's that nice middle ground. You're still getting a pretty decent resolution, and when you down it to 24 frames, it doesn't look as choppy because your shutter speed is only at 120 as opposed to 240. See, there is like a difference in like that choppy look. And a couple other pros is 60 frames also isn't like super duper slow. So you're able to get moments, but they don't last like crazy long. sort of stuff that I would capture 60 frames for is like nice, beautiful, happy stuff. If I'm filming anything like out in nature, or if I have to do, let's say, like a handheld movement, but I want it to look super smooth, I'll put that down in 60 frames and shoot that. Or let's say if I'm on a gimbal, gimbals slowed down, it just adds an additional bit of stability. So this can really come into your favor when it comes to like stabilizing footage. But the big thing too is this can look overused and be overused. And this is parallel to like 120 frames as well. If you are using this frame rate and convert it down to 24 frames, it's gonna look sharp, it's gonna look like shuddery and jittery. And if you're having a moment that maybe is an action-packed, it's going to give, let's say, a slow moment a fast speed. And I actually think that this jittery, shuddery look almost looks not that professional, especially if you're not going for it. It works well with action, but outside of that, it feels just kind of strange and out of place. So if you don't need to have your shutter cranked up to that level, change your frame rate and transition over to the golden frame rate, which is 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second is sort of like the most traditional frame rate that's used for cinema. The middle ground is like 30 frames per second. That's what you see in like old DV cams, and just like a weird, I don't like the look of it at all. But the golden child for me is 24 frames. And the reason why I like it so much, and the reason why I've been using it more and more on projects, is because it has a very real and organic flavor. As opposed to like when you have to crank your shutter up for something like 60 frames per second, at 24 frames, it's gonna feel like real life. Our eyes don't get that like crazy gritty look. Your audience is gonna feel like they're in the moment a lot more. Now, if we were to slow down 24 frames, what happens is you get like this really sort of dated slow-mo effect. I don't recommend it. I mean, it works for certain projects. Like I know like Slumdog Millionaire did this, and it's a really neat thing. And I'll put this out to you guys if you're able to use this effect to your advantage. I have yet to have found a project where this really works, although I'm still holding it in my back pocket, sort of like what Danny Boyle did in Slumdog. It looked really cool, and the movie won for best cinematography, so he has something right there. It's very limited and definitely is less effective as the other frame rates, but again, if you guys can do something cool with this, link that in the comments. I would absolutely love to see an effective way of using this sort of shutter speed slow down. Personally, as an artist, I actually embrace limitation more than avoid it. I like having a sort of creative box. I like having a canvas to work off of. When things are infinite, it's really difficult for me to focus because my brain is bouncing around. So when I limit myself to a specific frame rate, let's say it's 24 frames per second, I know that all of my coverage has to fill that flavor. I know I can't do super slow-mo stuff. I know that my shots should last longer than 5 seconds. There are certain limitations that actually enhance my creativity, and I start thinking of different shot choices. So diversify what you have available. If you shoot primarily at 60 frames per second, try doing 120. If you're shooting only slow-mo stuff, try doing 24. Maybe be crazy and try 30 frames and slow it down like 80%. The biggest thing that I want to recommend to all of you filmmakers out there is the fact that there is a diverse range of frame rates, and you should never live in just one because A, everybody else is doing it, and B, out of a sense of simplicity. If it's hard and it's complex, maybe that's gonna challenge your creativity. And for those of you who are like, Zach, I love this content and want to expand your filmmaking brain, well, you guys can subscribe to the PremiumBeat YouTube page. There's a lot of really great content there from some other super creative people and incredible creators at that. I cannot wait to see the different content that you create with the frame rates at your disposal. Change things up, keep making some great stuff, and I'll see you guys in another video.